Little girl's life was shattered. But Hell's Angels bikers' promise to protect her gave her a new beginning. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The night was cold, the wind howling through the empty streets as little Emma, no older than 7, stood in the middle of a chaotic scene, her small body trembling from fear. Her life had already been shattered by the events that had brought her here, but it wasn't just the cold air that made her shiver. It was the feeling of abandonment, the overwhelming sense of helplessness that weighed heavily on her tiny shoulders. She had witnessed things no child should ever see, and yet, here she was, trying to find solace in a world that had turned upside down. As she stood there, her mind racing, she suddenly heard the roar of an engine in the distance. A deep, rumbling sound that grew louder and louder, until the powerful Harley-Davidson emerged from the darkness. The motorcycle's headlights cut through the night, casting long shadows across the street. Emma's heart skipped a beat as the figure riding the bike appeared before her. A towering man clad in black leather, the unmistakable patches of the Hell's Angels emblazoned on his vest. He looked like someone straight out of a nightmare, a giant, fearsome figure that most people would have crossed the street to avoid. But for Emma, something about him was different. The moment their eyes met, something inside her stirred. She had no way of knowing, but the biker, Jack "Razor" Thompson, had seen too much in his life to ignore what was happening in front of him. He was a man who had built walls around his heart over the years, a man who lived by a strict code, and a man who didn't get involved with strangers. But that night, something about Emma's face, her wide, frightened eyes, her vulnerable stance, made him stop. Against all his instincts, he killed the engine and dismounted. "Are you all right?" His voice was gruff, worn from years of shouting over the noise of engines and chaos. But there was a softness underneath, a gentleness he didn't show to many people. Emma, startled, took a step back, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. She didn't know who this man was, but his presence felt like both a threat and a promise. I'm lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack kneeled down, bringing himself to her level. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I'll make sure you're safe." Emma hesitated, her heart racing. She had been let down by so many before, but something about the biker's words made her believe him. Jack gently extended his hand, offering her the protection she so desperately needed. He knew the danger she faced, the kind of world she was trying to survive in. Without thinking, he wrapped his jacket around her small frame, offering what little warmth he could. He could feel her trembling against him, her tiny body cold with fear and exhaustion. He was used to being the one feared, the one others avoided. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something else, a deep, instinctual need to protect, to make sure this little girl was safe. With a promise to her, Jack knew he was not just saving her life that night. He was about to give her a new beginning. After a long, tense ride, Jack "Razor" Thompson arrived at his garage, the one place where he could escape the chaos of the world. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the chill of the night. Emma, wrapped in Jack's leather jacket, sat quietly beside him on the bike. He could feel her tiny hands clutching his waist, her body still trembling from fear and the cold. As they reached the garage, Jack stopped the bike, its engine dying in the stillness of the night. He helped Emma off the bike, guiding her toward the warmth of the small space he called home. The garage smelled of motor oil, rust, and old leather, a scent that reminded Jack of a life he couldn't escape, but a life he had come to know and love. It wasn't much, but it was his. He walked Emma inside, the fluorescent lights flickering as they cast a pale glow over the old workbench and scattered motorcycle parts. The place was a mess, cluttered with tools and half-finished projects. It wasn't the type of place a child should be, but Jack had no choice. He couldn't just leave her out there alone. "You can sit here," Jack said, motioning to a dusty old couch in the corner of the garage. "I'll get you something warm." Emma nodded quietly, still unsure of what was happening. She hadn't said much since they left the street, her mind still reeling from the events that had unfolded. Jack went to the small kitchenette at the back of the garage, his boots echoing in the silence as he moved about, heating some water for tea. He had no idea how to care for a child, but something inside him told him this was the right thing to do. He returned with a cup of hot tea, carefully handing it to Emma. "Here," he said softly. "This should warm you up a bit." Emma hesitated for a moment, then took the cup from him, cradling it in her hands. She didn't speak at first, just stared at the steam rising from the cup. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken thoughts and fears. Jack couldn't help but notice how small and fragile she seemed, how vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the tough, hardened life he was used to. He sat down across from her, watching her carefully. "You're safe here," Jack said after a long pause. "No one's going to hurt you." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's heart softened, a pang of guilt creeping up inside him. He didn't know why he was helping her. It wasn't like him to get involved in anyone's problems, especially not a little girl's. But something about her, something about the way she looked at him, made him want to protect her. "Because someone has to," Jack replied quietly. "And right now, that someone is me." Emma took a small sip of her tea, her hands shaking slightly. Jack watched her, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had just taken on. He wasn't used to being a protector, but something in him had snapped when he saw her standing there, alone and scared. He had made a promise to himself, to her, that he wouldn't let her down. The hours passed slowly in the dimly lit garage, Emma sitting on the couch, Jack working on a bike at the far end of the room. The steady sound of his wrench on the metal was soothing, a small distraction from the swirling thoughts in his mind. He knew he couldn't keep her here forever, but for tonight, she was safe. He couldn't give her a perfect life, but he could give her a chance to escape the nightmare that had torn her life apart. As Jack worked, he couldn't shake the image of her face when they first met. She had looked so small, so fragile, yet there was a strength in her eyes that he hadn't expected. She was just a little girl, but she had already been through more than most people would in a lifetime. And yet, despite everything, she was still here, still fighting. Jack had seen many people break under pressure, seen them give up when the world got too heavy. But Emma wasn't like that. She had been broken, yes, but she wasn't beyond repair. He knew he had to help her, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that chance away from her. "What's your name?" Emma asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Jack looked up from his work, surprised by the question. "Jack," he said simply. "But most people call me Razor." Emma nodded slowly. "Razor? That's a cool name." Jack gave a small smile, the first genuine one he had in a long time. "It's just a name," he said, returning to his bike. "But you can call me Jack if you want." "Okay, Jack," Emma said softly. There was a pause, and then she spoke again. "Thank you for helping me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." Jack didn't say anything at first. He just kept working, his mind racing with the weight of his decision. He had always lived his life alone, relying on no one but himself. But now, here he was, helping a little girl who had nowhere else to turn. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to care, but he did. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he was doing something right. Jack sat at the workbench, the sound of his wrench on metal filling the room. He was used to the silence, the solitude of his garage, but tonight was different. Tonight, Emma was here, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he hadn't expected. He glanced over at her sitting on the couch, her small form wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide with curiosity. She had been so quiet since they arrived, her mind probably still processing everything that had happened. Jack had been in situations like this before, where the weight of the world seemed to press down on you. But for Emma, it was different. She wasn't just dealing with fear or confusion. She was dealing with a shattered life, a life that had been torn apart in ways no child should ever experience. As Jack worked, he tried to keep his thoughts focused on the bike in front of him. But every now and then, his eyes would drift back to Emma. He wondered what she was thinking, if she felt safe here, if she even believed that things could get better. He had no answers for her, but he knew he couldn't let her face the world alone. Jack had never been the type of person to make promises, but something about Emma made him want to change that. He had promised to protect her, to give her a chance at something better. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he wasn't going to let her fall through the cracks. He was going to help her rebuild her life, piece by piece. As the hours passed, Emma grew more comfortable, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. Jack had made her a warm meal, something simple but comforting, and they sat together at the small table in the corner of the garage, eating in silence. It wasn't much, but for now it was enough. I used to be good at fixing things, Jack said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Emma looked up from her plate, her eyes curious. You mean motorcycles? She asked. Jack nodded. Yeah, motorcycles, cars, whatever needed fixing. It's what I did before everything changed. He paused, his thoughts drifting. I don't know if I can fix you, Emma, but I'm going to try. Emma's eyes softened as she looked at him. You're already fixing me, she said quietly. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but somehow, it felt right. Later that night, as Emma drifted off to sleep on the couch, Jack sat by the window, watching the rain start to fall again. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him. The uncertainty, the fear, the weight of responsibility. But there was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, or how he was going to protect Emma from whatever came next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than just surviving. Maybe he could help someone else survive too. The days that followed were quiet, a welcome change for both Jack and Emma. In the calm of the garage, surrounded by the tools of his past life, Jack found a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Emma, though still a little hesitant, began to settle into her new reality. She spent her days quietly reading, playing with the few toys Jack had managed to find for her, and sometimes just sitting with him as he worked on his bikes. There was no rush to talk about what had happened, no pressure to rush the healing. Jack didn't ask her to share, and Emma didn't feel the need to explain herself. She just wanted to feel safe, and for the first time in a long time, she did. Jack, for his part, focused on fixing up the garage, putting in the effort to make it a space that felt like home, a place where Emma could truly start over. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be moments when the past would resurface, threatening to drag them back into the darkness they were both trying to escape. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. One afternoon, as Jack worked on a bike in the back corner of the garage, Emma approached him, holding something in her small hands. It was a picture, a drawing, something she had worked on during the day. She held it out to him with a shy smile, her cheeks flushed with the effort of offering something to him. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and took the drawing. It was a picture of the two of them, Jack sitting on his bike, with Emma standing beside him, both of them drawn in simple lines but filled with emotion. At the bottom, in Emma's neat handwriting, were the words, "My protector." Jack felt a tightness in his chest as he looked at the drawing. It wasn't just a picture. It was a symbol of everything he had promised to do for her. He had promised to protect her, to give her a new beginning, and seeing those words on the paper made him realize how much those promises had already meant to her. "It's beautiful, Emma," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma beamed at the compliment, her eyes lighting up with happiness. She hadn't had many reasons to smile lately, but this small gesture was enough to bring a spark of joy into her life. Jack carefully set the drawing on the workbench and turned back to the bike, trying to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the drawing. He had always been a man of few words, preferring to let his actions speak for him. But Emma's simple trust, her belief in him, made him want to do more. It made him want to be better, not just for her, but for himself as well. That evening, as the sun set and the garage grew dim, Jack found himself sitting next to Emma, watching the light fade outside. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were no longer alone in the world. Jack had never been good at being vulnerable, never been the type to open up to anyone, but with Emma, it felt different. He didn't need to explain himself to her. She didn't ask for his past, his mistakes, or the scars that lined his soul. All she wanted was his protection, and that was something Jack could give. Over time, the bond between them grew stronger. Jack became more than just her protector. He became the only person she could truly trust. She had no family left, no one else to turn to. But Jack was always there, offering her the stability and care she had long been denied. And Jack, in turn, found himself growing attached to her in ways he never expected. He had never thought much about having a family, about caring for someone who depended on him. But Emma had changed all that. She had reminded him that there was more to life than the lonely existence he had built for himself. One night, as Jack was preparing to lock up the garage for the night, he heard a knock on the door. It was a soft sound, almost hesitant, but it caught his attention. He opened the door to find a familiar face, one of the local shop owners who had known Jack for years. "Hey, Jack," the man said, his voice low. "I heard about the girl. The one you've been looking after." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What about her?" The man shifted uncomfortably, glancing behind him before looking back at Jack. "I just wanted to say, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. People around here talk, and they're worried about her. People like her. They don't always get the help they need." Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. The last thing he needed was people in the town starting to poke around in their business. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep Emma's presence in the garage a secret. "Thanks," Jack said gruffly, closing the door before the man could say anything else. As he locked it, Jack felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had made a promise to Emma, but promises didn't always keep people safe. Not in a world where secrets had a way of catching up with you. He turned to look at Emma, who was already in bed, her small figure curled up under the blanket. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt the flicker of something inside him. It was hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could give Emma the life she deserved. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As the days turned into weeks, Jack settled into a rhythm he hadn't known in years. The garage, once a place of solitude, had become a safe haven. Emma had slowly started to open up, her walls gradually coming down as she trusted Jack more and more. Jack, too, found himself growing attached to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just a girl he had promised to protect. She had become a part of his life. They shared quiet mornings over cups of coffee, evenings spent with Emma drawing or reading while Jack worked on his bikes. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs. Jack found comfort in the simplicity of their routine, in the way Emma's laughter had started to fill the spaces of his life that had been silent for so long. Yet, despite the peace they had found, Jack knew it wouldn't last forever. He could feel the weight of the world pressing in on them, a world that was always watching, always waiting to tear them apart. One morning, as Jack was finishing his breakfast, he heard the rumble of motorcycles outside. His first instinct was to get up and look out the window, but then he paused. He recognized the sound. There were too many bikes, too many people, and he knew exactly who they were. The Hells Angels. The thought hit him like a wave. It had been weeks since any of them had come by. He had been keeping his distance, trying to stay out of the life he had once known, but now, it seemed, the past was catching up with him. He glanced over at Emma, who was sitting at the table, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Jack, who are they?" she asked, her voice soft, almost unsure. Jack stood up slowly, trying to mask the tension that had suddenly gripped him. He didn't want her to see the worry in his eyes. "Just some friends from my old club," he said, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed him. He knew he couldn't keep Emma in the dark forever. Sooner or later, she would have questions, and he wasn't sure how to answer them. He wasn't sure how to explain the life he had left behind, or the people who had once been his brothers. Jack stepped outside, his boots heavy on the concrete, his mind racing. As he approached the gate, he saw them, the familiar faces, the weathered leather jackets, the Hells Angels patches that marked them as part of the brotherhood. They had come for a reason, and Jack wasn't sure he was ready for it. "Razor," a voice called from the group. It was Steele, the president of the local chapter. Jack stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. "You've been keeping a low profile, huh?" Steele said with a smirk, but there was an edge to his voice. Jack nodded. "I've been busy," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. Steele's eyes flicked over to the garage behind Jack, where Emma was now standing in the doorway, watching them curiously. "We heard about the girl," Steele said, his voice lowering. Jack's stomach churned. He knew this was coming. "She's fine," Jack said firmly. "She's under my protection." Steele stepped forward, his eyes hardening. "Protection? Is that what you're calling this? He gestured toward the garage, toward the small life Jack had built with Emma. You think you can just walk away from the club and live some quiet life? Jack's fists clenched at his sides. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Steele to show up with a demand, a question, a judgment. I'm not going back, Jack said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. I'm done with all that. I'm trying to give her something better. Steele studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. You think this life, this little garage, is better? He asked, his voice almost mocking. Jack met his gaze, refusing to back down. Yes, he said, the word coming out stronger than he expected. It is. Steele's face twisted into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Well, Razor, you're gonna have to make a choice. Jack's heart raced as he took a step forward. He didn't know what Steele meant, but he could feel the tension building. What choice? Jack asked, his voice low. Steele's smile faded. You can keep hiding away in your little garage, pretending to live a normal life. Or you can come back to the club and do things the right way. We need you, Razor. We need the man who built this club. Jack's jaw tightened. He had spent so many years building a life that was defined by violence, by loyalty, by a code he no longer believed in. He wasn't that man anymore. He was someone else now, someone who wanted to protect Emma, who wanted to make sure she had a future that didn't include the Hells Angels. Jack took a deep breath and made his decision. I'm not going back, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. I made a promise, and I'm going to keep it. Steele's expression hardened. He took a step back, his gaze cold. Then you've made your choice, Razor, he said, his voice low with warning. But don't think you can walk away without consequences. Jack didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward the garage, where Emma was waiting. He knew that things were about to get complicated, that the past was never truly behind him. But he was ready. He had a new life to protect now, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. As he reached the door, he looked back at Steele and the others, the weight of their gaze heavy on his back. Goodbye, he said softly, closing the door behind him. Inside, Emma was still standing by the window, her face filled with worry. Jack walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. Everything's okay, he said, his voice gentle. You're safe here. Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. But who were they? She asked, her voice small. Jack took a deep breath, his heart heavy. He knew he couldn't protect her from everything, but he could protect her from this. They're just people from my past, he said softly. They won't bother us again. Emma nodded slowly, but Jack could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. He knew that he couldn't shield her from everything, but he was going to try, and that was a promise he was going to keep. The days that followed the confrontation with Steele were filled with tension, but Jack tried to keep the peace in his small garage. He worked on his bikes, kept busy with repairs, and ensured Emma was safe, but a weight hung in the air. He could feel the unease of the situation creeping into every corner of his life. The last thing he wanted was for Emma to be caught in the middle of his past. He had promised her safety, a new beginning, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. Emma seemed to sense the change, her usually bright eyes now shadowed with concern. She never asked directly about the club or the men Jack had once called brothers, but she couldn't help but notice the tension in his shoulders and the way his gaze would linger on the door whenever he heard a motorcycle rumble outside. She had been through too much to ignore the silence that spoke louder than words. One afternoon, after Jack had spent hours in the back corner of the garage working on an old engine, he finally called it a day. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the room, and Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead, stretching his sore muscles. He glanced over at Emma, who was sitting on the couch, her legs pulled up to her chest as she quietly drew in her notebook. It had become a quiet ritual, Jack working on his bikes, and Emma retreating into her art, her way of making sense of the world. She looked up when she felt his eyes on her, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Jack could see the questions swirling in her eyes, the worry that had been building since the day Steele showed up. You okay? Jack asked, his voice soft. Emma nodded but didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jack knew her better than anyone. He had seen the way she had closed off when she first arrived, the walls she had built around herself to protect her fragile heart. And now, after weeks of living together, he could see those walls coming down, slowly but surely. But this was different. This was something deeper, something she couldn't easily hide. Jack walked over to her, sitting down beside her on the couch. "Hey," he said gently. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself, you know?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she bit her lip, her small hands gripping her notebook. "I'm not scared of them, Jack," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared of losing you." Jack's heart ached at her words. He had never been good at being the hero, at being the protector. But here she was, trusting him, depending on him. He wasn't about to let her down. "You won't lose me, Emma," he said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "I promised you, and I'm not breaking that promise. We're in this together." Emma didn't say anything in response, but her shoulders seemed to relax, the tension in her body easing for the first time in days. Jack sat with her for a moment, the quiet between them comfortable. He had made a lot of mistakes in his life, but right now, he was determined not to make another one. He wasn't going to let Emma face the world alone. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, the sound of a motorcycle echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Jack froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Emma noticed the sudden stillness and looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Is it them?" she asked, her voice small. Jack didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The bike was too familiar, the deep rumble that only one person's bike could make. Steele had returned. Jack stood up slowly, his mind racing. He had no idea what Steele wanted now, but he wasn't going to let him push him back into that life. Not now, not ever again. "Stay inside, Emma," Jack said, his voice firm but gentle. "Lock the door behind you and don't open it for anyone." Emma nodded, her eyes wide with worry, but she didn't argue. Jack walked to the door, his hand resting on the handle. He knew this conversation was inevitable. He knew that Steele wouldn't let him go without a fight. But he was done fighting for something he didn't believe in anymore. He had a new life now, a life he wasn't willing to throw away. When Jack opened the door, Steele was standing there, his face unreadable. "You've been avoiding us," Steele said, his voice low, almost amused. Jack stood his ground, his gaze hardening. "I'm not going back, Steele. I told you that." Steele's eyes flicked past Jack, his gaze landing on the garage behind him. "And what about her?" he asked, his tone shifting. "You think you can just live in isolation, pretending you've got it all figured out?" Jack's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. "I'm doing what's right," he said, his voice steady. "I promised her a better life, and I'm not letting you or anyone else take that away from her." Steele studied him for a moment, his expression hardening. "You're making a mistake, Razor," he said, his voice cold. "You can't run from your past forever." Jack didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "I'm not running from anything," Jack said. "I've made my choice, and you're not part of it." Steele seemed to hesitate, his gaze flicking to the side, as if weighing his next words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "You've chosen her, huh?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. Steele gave him one last look, then turned and walked away, his motorcycle roaring to life behind him. Jack stood in the doorway, watching as Steele disappeared into the night. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if this was the last time he would see Steele, or if the past would come back to haunt him. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take Emma from him. Not now, not ever. Jack stood by the door for a few moments, the sound of the motorcycle engines fading into the distance. The tension in his chest slowly started to ease, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite over lingered. He closed the door and locked it, turning to find Emma standing in the doorway of the living space, her small face full of concern. Jack smiled reassuringly, though the weight of the conversation with Steele still hung heavy on his shoulders. "It's all right, Emma," he said softly, walking toward her. "Everything's fine." Emma nodded, though her eyes didn't quite match the calm tone of his voice. She had grown accustomed to Jack's protective nature, but she could sense something had shifted. She could tell that the world outside their little garage wasn't going to let them live in peace for long. Jack crouched down in front of her, meeting her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, making sure she understood. "You're safe here with me. No one's going to take that away." Emma bit her lip and hugged her knees to her chest. "I know, Jack. But, do you think they'll come back?" Jack paused. It was the question he had been avoiding. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to frighten her unnecessarily. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together. We'll be ready." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and then, as if deciding something, she gave him a small nod. I trust you, she said quietly. Jack smiled and reached out, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. That's all I need to hear. Over the next few days, Jack kept busy. He worked on the bikes, cleaned up the garage, and did everything he could to keep things normal for Emma. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about what Steele had said. He had made his choice, but that didn't mean the past would let him go easily. Jack had known the Hells Angels long enough to understand that loyalty ran deep, and breaking that loyalty wasn't something that was easily forgotten. He couldn't just walk away and pretend that everything would be fine. There would be consequences, there always were. As the days passed, Jack's unease grew. He kept an eye on the road outside, waiting for another sign that the past was catching up with him. He didn't want to live in fear, but he couldn't ignore the fact that the life he had left behind was still very much alive. Then, one evening, as Jack was cleaning up after dinner, he heard it. The unmistakable roar of motorcycles. He froze for a moment, his heart racing. This time, it wasn't just a few bikes passing by. It was a whole group, their engines loud and clear in the distance. Jack moved quickly, glancing at Emma, who was sitting at the table, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Stay inside, Emma, he said, his voice low and calm. Lock the door behind you and don't come out for anything. Emma didn't argue. She knew better than to ask questions when Jack's tone was serious. Jack moved swiftly to the door, opening it just a crack to peek outside. The bikes were getting closer. He could hear them now, the rumble of the engines echoing in the quiet night. Jack stepped back from the door, his mind racing. He knew it was them. He knew who had come back. It was Steele and his crew. They weren't just here for a casual visit. They had come to collect. Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to happen. He wasn't sure what their intentions were, but he wasn't about to back down. Not now, not when Emma's safety was on the line. He turned toward the garage and grabbed the crowbar. He kept near the door. It wasn't that he thought he needed it, but he wanted to be prepared. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with Steele showing up again. Jack was ready for whatever came next. When the knock came, he didn't hesitate. He walked to the door and opened it, revealing Steele standing on the other side, flanked by two other members of the Hells Angels. Steele's eyes narrowed as he looked at Jack, his arms crossed over his chest. You really thought you could walk away, Razor? Steele's voice was low, but there was a hint of amusement in it. You think this life is just something you can leave behind? Jack stood firm, his jaw clenched. I made my choice, Steele. I'm done with all of that. You know that. Steele's gaze flicked past Jack, his eyes landing on the garage, then Emma, who was peeking through the window behind Jack. The moment of silence stretched out, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let them intimidate her. He couldn't let them see her weakness. She's part of this now, Steele said, his voice cold. You know the rules, Razor. You can't just leave and expect everything to stay the same. The club doesn't let go. Jack stepped forward, blocking Steele's view of the window. She's not part of your club. She's not part of that world. And I'm not going back. So, you can either walk away, or I can show you the door. Steele's eyes flickered with something. Anger, frustration, or maybe even respect. Jack couldn't tell. You've really gone soft, haven't you? Steele muttered. You think you can protect her in here, behind these walls. Jack's fists clenched, but he held his ground. I've been protecting people my whole life. And I'm not stopping now. The tension in the air was thick, but Steele finally seemed to make a decision. He turned on his heel, motioning for his men to follow him. This isn't over, Razor, he said, his voice hard. We'll be watching. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He closed the door as they walked away, his heart still racing. He didn't know what Steele's warning meant, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made the right choice. He was done with the club, done with the life he had known. And he wasn't going to let anything or anyone take Emma from him. Not now, not ever. The following days were quieter, but the unease that had settled in Jack's chest didn't let up. He kept his head down, working on bikes, cleaning up the garage, and making sure Emma stayed inside, away from the prying eyes of the world. But the moment Steele and his crew had left, Jack knew it wasn't over. They had made it clear that they weren't going to forget about him so easily. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to slip, waiting for him to make a mistake. The last thing Jack wanted was to drag Emma back into that life. He had promised her a future, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. Still, The world didn't let you walk away from your past without consequences. The sound of motorcycles grew more frequent around the garage, but Jack refused to let it shake him. Every time he heard the rumble of an engine, his heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. He wouldn't let fear control him. He would protect Emma. One afternoon, after a long day of working on a bike, Jack sat down on the worn leather chair in the corner of the garage, his body aching from the constant work. He glanced over at Emma, who was sitting on the floor with a book in her hands. She was more relaxed now than she had been when she first arrived, but there was still a quiet sadness about her, something that Jack knew she wasn't ready to share. She had come so far, but Jack could see that there was still a lot of healing to be done. He couldn't fix everything for her, but he could offer her a stable home, a place where she could finally feel safe. "How's the book?" Jack asked, trying to break the silence. Emma looked up from her pages, her eyes bright. "It's good," she said, her voice soft but filled with a sense of calm that Jack hadn't heard in weeks. "It's about a girl who runs away and finds a new family." Jack smiled gently. "Sounds like something you could relate to." Emma nodded slowly, her fingers turning the pages absent-mindedly. "I guess so," she said, her voice quieter now. Jack didn't press her to explain further. He knew she was still processing everything, still figuring out what it meant to be in a place that felt safe. But the change in her, the quiet strength that was beginning to emerge, made Jack feel like maybe, just maybe, they were both on the right path. Later that evening, as Jack cleaned up the garage, he heard a familiar sound, a motorcycle engine, slow and deliberate. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. He recognized that sound. It was the same bike that had rumbled into the driveway a few days earlier. Steele had returned. Jack walked to the door and peered through the small crack. Sure enough, there was Steele, parked right outside the garage with two other members of the Hells Angels standing behind him. Jack's stomach tightened. He had known it was coming, but he had hoped it wouldn't happen so soon. He had to face this head-on, for Emma's sake. He couldn't let her be afraid again. Jack opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch. Steele looked up when he saw Jack, his face a mixture of frustration and amusement. "I thought you'd be hiding out by now," Steele said, his voice low. Jack stood his ground, his body tense but steady. "I'm not hiding," he said firmly. "I made my choice. I'm not going back." Steele didn't seem surprised. "You've made your bed, Razor. But you can't keep running from your past. You think you can just forget about the club? About everything we've been through?" Jack's fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not running from anything," he said quietly, his voice low but resolute. "I'm trying to build something here. Something better." Steele's eyes narrowed, and Jack could see the challenge in them. "You think this little garage and that girl inside are all it takes to make you forget who you really are?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, blocking Steele's view of the garage. "She's not part of your world, Steele," Jack said. "And I'm not going back to that life. You can't make me." Steele seemed to hesitate for a moment, his expression darkening. He exchanged a look with the other men standing behind him before turning back to Jack. "We'll see about that," Steele muttered, before turning on his heel and walking away. Jack stood in the doorway, watching them leave. His chest tightened as the weight of Steele's words settled in. He knew this wasn't the end. Steele would be back, and so would the rest of the club. But Jack wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let them drag him back into a life he had left behind. He would protect Emma, no matter what it took. He walked back inside, locking the door behind him. Emma was still sitting on the couch, her book forgotten in her lap. She looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with questions. "What happened?" she asked softly. Jack hesitated for a moment, taking in the look of concern on her face. He had promised her that she would be safe here, and he wasn't about to break that promise. "Nothing," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Just some old business, but it's nothing to worry about. You're safe here with me." Emma seemed to accept his words, though Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. He knew she wasn't fooled, but he also knew she didn't want to ask too many questions. She had been through enough. Jack sat down next to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I won't let anything happen to you, Emma," he said quietly. "I promise." Emma smiled up at him, the first real smile he had seen from her in days. Jack smiled back, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He would keep his promises. He would protect Emma, and he would keep her safe, no matter what. Jack had spent the next few days trying to keep his mind focused on the routine of everyday life, but the weight of the recent visit from Steele and his crew continued to hang over him. The sound of motorcycles in the distance had become a constant reminder that his past was never far behind. Emma, too, had grown more quiet as the days passed, her eyes often drifting toward the door when she heard a bike rev in the distance. Jack knew that she was starting to understand the reality of their situation. It wasn't just about hiding away in the garage and pretending everything was fine. It was about facing the things they couldn't escape. Jack had never been one for talking about his feelings. In fact, he had spent most of his life shutting them down, ignoring them, burying them deep inside. But now, with Emma in his care, something had changed. He couldn't hide anymore. He couldn't afford to. One evening, after a long day of working on the bike, Jack found himself sitting at the kitchen table, the dim light from the old lamp casting shadows on the worn wooden surface. Emma was in the other room, humming softly to herself as she worked on one of her drawings. Jack watched her for a moment, her small figure bent over the paper, the focus in her eyes that reminded him of the way she had approached everything in life. Quiet, determined, and unafraid to face whatever was thrown her way. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had come so far since the day he had found her. He hadn't realized how much he had changed, too, until now. He wasn't the same man he had been when he walked away from the Hells Angels, and he wasn't the same man he had been when he first met Emma. There was something about her strength, that had broken down the walls he had spent so long building around his heart. It made him want to be better, not just for her, but for himself, too. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when he heard a knock on the door. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not now. Not after everything. He stood up slowly, walking to the door with a sense of unease creeping up his spine. When he opened it, he found a familiar face standing on the other side. It was Maya, a local sheriff's deputy who had stopped by a few times to check in on him. Jack hadn't spoken to her much, but there was something about her that made him feel a little more at ease. She was one of the few people in town who didn't look at him like he was a ghost. "Hey, Jack," Maya said with a warm smile, though Jack could see the tension in her eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Jack said, trying to sound casual, though he felt a knot form in his stomach. "What's going on?" Maya glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was watching. "I just wanted to let you know that the situation with Steele and his crew, well, it's not going to be forgotten. People are talking, Jack." Jack's jaw tightened. He knew this day was coming. He had tried to keep Emma out of the spotlight, but it seemed inevitable that the past would catch up with them. "What are you saying?" Jack asked, his voice low. Maya hesitated, looking down at the ground before meeting his gaze again. "I'm not here to make threats, Jack," she said quietly. "But you need to be careful. If you think they'll just let you walk away, you're wrong." Jack swallowed hard. He had always known this was going to happen, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real, more dangerous. "I'm not going back," he said, his voice firm. "And I'm not going to let them drag Emma into this." Maya nodded slowly, her expression serious. "I know that, Jack. But you're not just dealing with Steele anymore. There are others who are watching. People who don't care about your promises or your choices. People who only care about loyalty." Jack clenched his fists at his sides. "I don't owe them anything," he said, his voice cold. "I left that life behind." Maya stepped forward, lowering her voice. "I know you think you've walked away, but you haven't. Not really. They'll come for you, and they'll come for her, too." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words, the reality of what she was saying. He had made a promise to Emma that he would protect her, but now, more than ever, he wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. "I won't let them touch her," Jack said through gritted teeth. "Not while I'm still breathing." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of understanding. "I'm not asking you to take this on alone, Jack. But you need to be ready. You need to be prepared for what's coming." Jack looked at her, his mind racing. He had never been one to plan for the future. He had always lived in the moment, always reacting to whatever life threw at him. But now, with Emma's safety on the line, he had to start thinking differently. He had to be ready for whatever came next. "I'll be ready," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'll protect her." Maya gave him a final nod before turning to leave, but not before pausing at the door. "I'll keep an eye on things around here, Jack," she said, her voice soft but reassuring. "You're not alone in this." Jack watched her walk away, the weight of her words lingering in the air. He turned back toward the house, his thoughts swirling. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to keep Emma safe. He wasn't going to let her down. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed Maya's visit were filled with a quiet tension that Jack could feel in the pit of his stomach. He had tried to push it aside, to focus on the small, everyday tasks that had come to define his new life with Emma, but the weight of her words hung over him like a storm cloud. He wasn't ready for what was coming. He had known it was coming, but somehow, hearing it out loud made it feel more real. The world he had left behind wasn't going to let him go without a fight, and neither would Steele or the others in the Hells Angels. Jack had tried to start fresh, to build something that was his own, but the past had a way of catching up. No matter how far he ran, it always seemed to be one step behind. Emma, too, seemed to sense the shift. She had always been perceptive, her eyes following Jack's every move, watching him more closely than he realized. She didn't ask questions, but he knew she could tell something was off. It wasn't just the motorcycles or the occasional knock on the door. It was the way Jack had become more withdrawn, his mind always drifting back to the past, to the people who were still waiting for him to return. That evening, as Jack sat at the table, his hands resting on the worn surface, he found himself lost in thought. Emma was in the other room, drawing once again. Her drawings had become more vivid, more detailed, as if she were channeling the emotions she didn't yet have the words to express. Jack watched her from the corner of his eye, wondering what went on inside her head. She had been through so much, more than anyone should ever have to face, and yet she still managed to hold on to that quiet strength. He admired that about her. The silence in the garage felt suffocating at times, but it was the kind of silence Jack had come to rely on. He had learned to live with it, to thrive in it. But now, with Emma in his life, the silence felt different. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the space between them, the unspoken bond they had formed in the quiet. Jack knew he had to protect that bond, no matter what. The sound of a motorcycle engine broke his train of thought, and his heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, his pulse racing as he walked to the door. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The rumble of the engine was too familiar. Jack stepped outside cautiously, his eyes scanning the darkening street. There was nothing in sight, but he knew better than to ignore it. The bike's engine grew louder, and Jack's grip tightened on the doorframe. This time, there was no denying it. Steele and his crew had returned. Jack turned and walked toward the back of the garage, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He had promised Emma that she would be safe, but how could he keep that promise when the past was still at his doorstep? He couldn't run forever. He had to face this. As Jack reached the back of the garage, he heard the door creak open behind him. He didn't need to look to know it was Emma. "Jack," she called softly. He turned to face her, trying to put on a calm expression, though he knew she could see through it. "Everything's okay," he said, his voice reassuring, though his heart wasn't in it. "Just stay inside for now. Don't open the door for anyone." Emma nodded, her expression unsure, but she didn't argue. Jack gave her a small smile before walking back toward the front of the garage, his footsteps heavy. The bikes were getting closer. Jack could hear the low growl of the engines as they pulled up outside. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short bursts as he walked to the door. When he opened it, Steele was standing there, his expression unreadable. "Razor," Steele said, his voice cool. "We need to talk." Jack didn't hesitate. "There's nothing to talk about," he said firmly. "I made my choice. I'm not going back." Steele's gaze flicked past Jack, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the garage. Jack could feel the weight of Steele's stare, the unspoken judgment that came with it. "You think you can just walk away from the club and forget everything?" Steele asked, his voice tinged with something cold. Jack stood his ground, his jaw set. "I'm not running from anything. I've made my choice. I'm not going back to that life." Steele took a step forward, his eyes hardening. "You think it's that easy, Razor?" he asked, his voice low. "You think you can just shut it all down like it was nothing?" Jack didn't flinch. "It's over," he said simply. Steele's expression hardened, his eyes flicking to the side. He didn't say anything for a moment, as if deciding something. Finally, he spoke. "You're making a big mistake." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. Steele turned on his heel and walked away, his men following him without a word. Jack stood there for a moment, watching them leave, his mind racing. He had made his choice, but the path ahead was still unclear. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going back. Not for anyone. Jack closed the door behind him, his hands still shaking. He looked over at Emma, who was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide. "It's over," Jack said quietly. "They're gone." Emma nodded slowly, though Jack could see the concern still in her eyes. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. Jack walked over to her and knelt down, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're safe here, Emma," he said softly. "I'll protect you. I won't let anyone take that away." Emma looked up at him, her small hand reaching out to squeeze his. Jack smiled, a real smile this time. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to live. And he was going to make sure they stayed that way, no matter what. The following days were filled with a tense calm, like the quiet before a storm. Jack had kept his promise to Emma, maintaining the fragile peace they had created in the garage, but a part of him knew it wouldn't last forever. Steele and his crew may have left for now, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they would be back. He had made a choice, and with it came the certainty that his past would continue to follow him, even if he couldn't outrun it. Emma, for her part, seemed to sense the change in Jack. She was quieter these days, her smile not as frequent, her eyes often distant, as if she were wondering what the future held. Jack wished he could give her more than just safety, more than just the empty comfort of a roof over her head. He wanted her to feel free, to feel like a child again, without the shadows of the past looming over her. But as much as he wished it, Jack knew the world didn't work that way. The past was always present, always waiting for a chance to pull them back in. One morning, as the sun filtered through the dusty windows of the garage, Jack found himself staring at the door, his mind lost in thought. He had been up early, working on the bike again, trying to keep himself occupied, but the nagging feeling of something unresolved still lingered. Emma was in the other room, drawing quietly as she had been doing every day. He had become accustomed to the sound of her pencil on paper, the steady rhythm of her little hand creating worlds that were entirely her own. Jack couldn't help but wonder what she was drawing, what her mind was processing behind those big, thoughtful eyes. He often wondered how much she understood about the world, about the life they were both trying to escape. As he sat there, the sound of a motorcycle engine broke through his thoughts. Jack's body tensed instinctively, his fingers tightening around the wrench in his hand. He knew that sound. It was too familiar. The rumble of the engine grew louder, and Jack stood up, walking slowly toward the door. This time, he didn't need to look outside to know who it was. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the weight of the past coming closer. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for another confrontation, but he knew it was inevitable. He had no choice. He had to face this. Jack opened the door and stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he took in the sight of Steele's motorcycle pulling up to the driveway. Steele was alone this time, his dark eyes narrowing as he stopped the engine and dismounted. Jack could see the coldness in his gaze, the unspoken challenge that hung between them. Steele didn't speak at first, his eyes flicking past Jack toward the garage behind him. "I thought you'd learned your lesson," Steele said finally, his voice low but carrying an edge of frustration. Jack didn't answer immediately. He wasn't going to give Steele the satisfaction of seeing him flinch, of seeing him show fear. He had made his choice, and nothing Steele said or did would change that. "I'm not going back to that life, Steele," Jack said calmly, his voice steady. "You can't make me. I'm done with it." Steele took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away and live your little quiet life here?" Steele's voice was almost mocking now. "You really think they'll just let you go like that?" Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I've already made my choice," Jack said again, his voice firm. "You may not like it, but that's not my problem." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of the tension thick in the air. Steele seemed to study him, as if searching for something, trying to read Jack's expression. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter but still filled with disdain. "You've got a lot of nerve, Razor," Steele said, his tone almost amused. "You think you can just walk away from everything and pretend it doesn't matter? From the club, from the loyalty, from everything you've built with us?" Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing with everything that had led him here. He had spent too many years being part of that world, and now, he was finally free of it. He wasn't going to let Steele, or anyone else pull him back. I'm not walking away from anything, Jack said, his voice steady. I'm choosing something else. I'm choosing to protect her. He nodded toward the garage, toward Emma, who was still inside, probably listening. Steele followed his gaze, his expression hardening when he saw the direction Jack's attention had shifted. So it's about her now? Steele asked, his voice low. You're letting a little girl tie you down? Is that what this is about? Jack's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't back down. I'm not letting anyone or anything take her from me, he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of a promise. Steele's eyes flickered with something. Maybe recognition, maybe anger. But Jack didn't care. This wasn't about Steele anymore. This was about Emma, about the life they were trying to build together, away from the chaos, away from the past. You made your choice, Steele said, his voice suddenly colder. But don't think you can walk away without consequences, Razor. You're still a part of us, whether you want to be or not. Jack stood his ground, meeting Steele's gaze. I'm done with the club, Jack said again, his voice unwavering. And I'm not looking back. Steele studied him for a moment longer before turning away, his motorcycle roaring to life as he and his men drove off into the night. Jack watched them leave, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't know what would come next, but he was ready. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. He turned and walked back inside, his footsteps steady and sure. Emma was sitting at the table, her eyes searching his face as if waiting for some sign of what had happened. Jack smiled at her, his heart swelling with the knowledge that, for the first time in a long time, he had done something right. It's over, Jack said softly. We're safe. Emma smiled back, her small face lighting up with relief. Jack knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to keep Emma safe, to protect the life they were building together. And this time, he was ready to fight for it. The next few weeks felt like a fragile peace, but Jack knew better than to let his guard down completely. Steele and his crew had left, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over. He had made it clear that he wasn't going back to the Hells Angels, but he also knew that once you made a break like that, there was no guarantee the past wouldn't come back to haunt you. Every sound, every motorcycle that passed by, sent a jolt through his body. Emma, too, had grown quieter. She had always been observant, but now she seemed to be watching everything with more attention, as if she were trying to understand the unspoken tension in the air. Jack had tried to shield her from the worst of it, but he knew she could sense the uncertainty that lingered just below the surface. Still, he kept his promises to her, no matter how hard it became. One evening, after a long day of fixing up a motorcycle in the garage, Jack found himself standing in front of the small window, staring out into the night. The air was still, and the stars shone brightly above. It was one of those rare, peaceful moments when the world felt quiet. He thought about the life he had left behind, the brotherhood he had walked away from, and the future he was trying to build. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't run forever. The past had a way of catching up. He knew Steele and his crew weren't just going to forget about him. They never did. Jack heard the familiar sound of Emma's voice calling from the back of the garage. Jack! She was standing in the doorway, her small figure illuminated by the soft light of the room behind her. Jack turned toward her, offering her a reassuring smile, though his mind was still racing. Hey, what's up? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to read the thoughts behind his expression. Are you worried about them coming back? She asked, her voice quiet. Jack's heart sank a little. He had hoped she hadn't noticed, but he should have known better. She was always so perceptive, so aware of the smallest changes in his mood. It's all right, Emma, Jack said, walking over to her. I'm not worried. We're safe here. Emma bit her lip, but she didn't say anything. Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to make her worry more than she already was. Look, Jack said, kneeling down in front of her. I know things have been a little tense lately, but we're okay. I won't let anything happen to you, I promise. Emma didn't respond at first, but after a moment, she nodded slowly. I know you won't let anything happen to me, she said quietly. Jack smiled and pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly for a moment. You're safe, Emma, he said softly. I'll always keep you safe. Emma rested her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Jack held her, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. That night, as Jack lay in bed, the sounds of the quiet garage and the soft breeze outside filling the room, he couldn't help but think about the future. He knew things weren't going to be easy. He knew that there were still people from his past who would come looking for him, people who wouldn't let him walk away without consequences. But Jack also knew one thing. He was ready to fight for the life he was building. For Emma. He wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. The next morning, Jack went out to the garage early, trying to clear his mind with a few hours of work. He focused on the bikes, his hands moving with practiced ease as he tightened bolts and adjusted gears. His thoughts were occupied with the tasks in front of him, but every now and then, his mind wandered to the looming uncertainty of the future. The sound of Emma's footsteps broke him out of his thoughts. He turned to see her standing at the door of the garage, a hesitant expression on her face. "Jack," she said softly, "I was thinking about what you said the other night." Jack wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to her. "What about it?" he asked. "I don't want you to worry so much," Emma said, looking up at him. "I know you're doing everything you can, and I know you'll protect me." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. She had already started to understand things that most kids her age wouldn't. She was so strong, so brave, and it made him want to shield her from everything that could hurt her even more. "You're right," Jack said, kneeling down to her level. "I shouldn't let it get to me. I'm just so focused on making sure you're safe. That's all I care about." Emma smiled up at him, her eyes shining with the kind of wisdom that Jack knew had come from living through too much for such a young child. "You're already doing that," she said. "I feel safe here, Jack. You don't have to do anything else." Jack smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't the kind of life he had ever imagined, but it was his now, and it was worth every bit of effort he had put into it. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for hers too. As the days went on, the tension slowly began to lift. Jack still kept a wary eye on the road, still listened for the sound of motorcycles in the distance, but he was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to build something that could last. For the first time in a long time, Jack allowed himself to believe that they had a future. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to face it alone. Not anymore. The weeks passed in a quiet haze, the world outside the garage continuing on as it always had. Jack and Emma settled into their routine, the rhythm of everyday life a comforting constant amidst the uncertainty. Jack kept his focus on the bikes, his hands moving with ease, repairing and fixing what needed to be done. The garage was his refuge, the place where he could shut out everything that threatened to pull him back into the life he had left behind. But despite the calm, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He knew that the Hells Angels wouldn't just let him walk away. They would test his resolve, see if he was truly ready to leave everything behind. Jack wasn't sure how long they would let him live in peace. He tried to keep Emma shielded from the weight of it all, but he knew she could sense the tension. She had grown more quiet over the past few weeks, her small face often reflecting the same uncertainty that Jack felt deep in his chest. She didn't ask questions anymore, but Jack could see the worry in her eyes whenever a motorcycle engine rumbled in the distance. He had told her she was safe, but he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. The world was unpredictable, and danger had a way of creeping in when you least expected it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack found himself sitting on the porch of the garage, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had always been the type to live in the moment, to keep his eyes focused on the task at hand, but tonight he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The sound of a motorcycle engine broke through his thoughts, and Jack stood up slowly, his heart skipping a beat. He had been expecting it, but he had hoped it wouldn't happen so soon. As the engine grew louder, Jack walked toward the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He saw the headlights of a motorcycle appear in the distance, growing larger with each passing second. Jack's stomach tightened. He didn't have to look to know who it was. He could feel it, the tension, the anticipation, the knowledge that this moment had been coming for weeks. The bike pulled up to the driveway, and Jack could see Steele, his expression unreadable as he dismounted. Jack's heart raced as he took a step forward. This time, he wasn't going to back down. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to let anyone or anything take that from him. Steele looked up at him, his eyes hard, the weight of the unspoken challenge between them. "Razor," Steele said, his voice low and steady. Jack didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. He knew what this was. Steele was here to test him, to see if he was truly ready to walk away from everything. What do you want, Steele? Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. Steele's gaze flicked past Jack, toward the garage. I thought you'd be hiding by now, Steele said, his tone almost mocking. Thought you'd be scared of what's coming. Jack stood his ground, refusing to show any sign of fear. I'm not hiding, Steele, he said quietly. I'm not running from anything anymore. Steele took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jack. You think you can just walk away, pretend nothing's changed? Steele asked, his voice tinged with something dark. You think you can protect her? Jack didn't flinch. I'm not pretending anything, he said, his voice unwavering. And I'm protecting her. I've made my choice. Steele's gaze flickered to the garage again, his expression hardening. You've got a lot to lose, Razor, Steele said, his voice low. You think this little life you've built here is going to last? Think it's enough to keep the past at bay? Jack stepped forward, his jaw tight. It's enough for me, he said quietly. Steele studied him for a moment longer, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, with a slow exhale, he stepped back. You've made your decision, huh? He said, his voice almost resigned. Fine, but don't think you won't pay the price for it. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. Steele turned and walked back to his motorcycle, the sound of the engine rumbling to life again. Jack watched as he and his crew drove off into the night, his heart still pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what Steele's words meant, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made the right choice. He wasn't going back. As the motorcycles faded into the distance, Jack turned back toward the garage. He could hear Emma moving inside, the sound of her footsteps soft but determined. She was always so quiet, so composed, but Jack knew she had been worried. She had seen the way he tensed when the bikes had arrived, and she knew the weight of what was happening. Jack walked inside and found her standing in the doorway, her eyes searching his face. Is it over? She asked softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Jack nodded slowly, offering her a reassuring smile. It's over, he said quietly. They're gone. Emma didn't say anything for a moment, but Jack could see the relief in her eyes. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. Jack squeezed her back, feeling the weight of everything that had happened slowly begin to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe they could start fresh. He could protect her, keep her safe, and together, they could build the life they had always deserved. Jack wasn't sure how long the peace would last, but for now, it was enough, and he was ready to fight for it. For her.